Well, we appreciate you joining us today for this first session of the 2024 AgrAbility National Training Workshop Encore webinars. Some of the webinars, or some of the presentations, I should say, that were popular during our in-person National Training Workshop in March. And our topic today is how to develop financial sustainability for your organization. Our presenter is Kent Schescke. He's currently a longtime member of the AgrAbility National Advisory Team, and I'll talk about some of his other previous positions in just a moment. I'm Paul Jones. For those who don't know me, I manage the National AgrAbility Project, which is headquartered at Purdue University. For those who are not familiar with AgrAbility, we are sponsored by the USDA, and we focus on assisting people in agriculture that have some type of disability or functional limitation. Every one of the AgrAbility projects around the country is a partnership between a land-grant university and at least one nonprofit disability services organization. And currently there are 21 state AgrAbility projects. Again, the National AgrAbility Project is led through Purdue University in our Breaking New Ground Resource Center. And our partners on that grant include Goodwill of the Finger Lakes, Osteoarthritis Action Alliance, AgriSafe Network, Colorado State University, and Washington State University. If you'd like to learn more about AgrAbility or view one of more than 160 archived webinars, you can visit agrability.org. Again, we are thankful to have our presenter today, Kent Schescke. He's a former Executive Vice President and CEO of the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology, known as CAST. He's also former Director of Strategic Partnerships for the National FFA organization. He has extensive experience in nonprofit sustainability, and again, he's one of our longstanding members of the National AgrAbility Advisory Team. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Kent for the body of the presentation.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for joining us today for this presentation. As Paul mentioned, I had the opportunity to be at the National Training Workshop back earlier this year and presented the same workshop, and we had a lot of questions and discussion and ran out of time to probably discuss it. So if you in the audience, maybe you came back to hear this one so you could ask that question that we didn't get to in that original presentation. But as Paul mentioned in my introduction, I've had the opportunity to work across 3 different nonprofits. I started my career as a high school agriculture teacher, but after about 14 years, transitioned into nonprofit management, worked for the National FFA and National FFA Foundation for many years, a couple of years with the National Junior Achievement Organization, back to FFA, and then the last 9 years of my career with the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. And in those roles, all of those roles, I had a big responsibility in this area of fundraising, development. How did we achieve sustainable financial stability in our organization? So I'm sharing lots of experience and lessons learned kind of along the way. And I look forward to some time at the end to discuss and a robust Q&A. Okay. So in my presentation today, you'll hear me talk about 10 things that you need to know about fundraising. I'm trying to kind of keep it pretty simple and pretty basic, and all the things that I think I talk about, hopefully you'll find some application in the work that you are doing and things that you're struggling with in your organization. Kind of a working philosophy, and where I like to start with this, is that fundraising and friend-raising go hand in hand. And what I mean by that is that relationships are important, and the relationships that you build with your funders and others in the work that you do, think about those from a fundraising context. And, how do we develop friends of the organization who can ultimately become supporters of the organization? I know a lot of you through your AgrAbility programs are supported in a large part by the grants that you receive to run the projects. But as your projects go on and sometimes those grant funding does not meet near the full needs, or there's things that you want to do outside of that, we have to think about how do we raise additional funds or other sources of funds that can help us either supplant or actually augment some of the funding things we want to do, and how can those be opportunities for our partners and others to join with you and your projects to help make these things happen. So think about, the work that you do every day and the networking you do, collecting and managing contacts and things like that becomes an important part of that, because all of that becomes, a key part of our fundraising success down the road. This is an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. When we talk about the sources of funding, the types of funding, and then some of the fundraising strategies that I found to be the most successful. And how do you use those? And we can maybe at the Q&A get a little deeper into it, but I'll try to provide kind of an overview of this information kind of in these three categories. So if you're taking notes today, you can kind of number your paper from 1 to 10 and kind of follow along the discussion and jot any questions or shoot any questions our way that you may have on these presentations. So we talk about sources of funding, and I'm going to talk outside of, you notice I haven't put government on there, because if you're in the AgrAbility program, I'm kind of assuming that you've kind of mastered that one. You kind of understand how government grants and seeking grants work. What we're really going to talk about is maybe the rest of the fundraising universe, and that really boils down to really three primary areas: corporations, foundations, and individuals. And we'll talk about each of those and kind of what are the relative attributes that those donors have, how are they best approached, and for what type of projects make sense when we start trying to engage them in the work that we're doing. This is some data I'd like to share, and it's from 2022, and it's really an overlook of all the philanthropic giving in the United States. And in 2022, for example, there was $499 billion that was donated from these sources to nonprofit organizations. And we kind of think about, well, where does that money come from? And in a minute, we'll look at where does that money go. But you can see the largest section of that, the part in kind of the bright yellow, orange, whatever it looks like on your screen, comes from individuals. The second part of that would be foundations. The third part is bequests, but bequests actually become a part of the individuals. So when you take the 64% that comes from individuals and you add the 9% that comes from bequests, you're really looking at about 73, almost 3/4 of all of the philanthropic dollars that are out there are coming from individuals, and either during their lifetime or things that are made a part of their will or bequests that they leave. And the other part of this, then they got the private foundations at 105,000, and they represent about 21%. And then corporations at really just only 6%. And I think sometimes the perceptions is that corporations are the largest funder in this segment. And in truth, that it's the opposite. They're the smallest funder in this segment, and we really need to think about making sure that we have developed robust channels of gifts from individuals, not only while they're from an individual basis, but also thinking about those longer term gifts that they're able to provide for organizations. Now let's look at the same chart and say, well, where does that money go? What's it used for? And you can see kind of on a sliding scale that the largest portion of that goes to religion. And think about that for those of us who attend church on a regular basis, every Sunday morning, whether we give it while we're at church or for many folks it's done through automatic withdrawals to their bank accounts or whatever mechanism they use, but they give on a very consistent basis to support religion. Now, all of these other groups contribute to that, but again, the biggest percentage of that is what is given through individuals. The next part would be in human services, and followed very closely by education, grants to grant-making foundations. So in some philanthropy, we see that money from individuals or others may flow to grant-making foundations, who in turn then make those same contributions or make contributions to other organizations. So you think about health, and then we move down to public and societal benefits, international affairs, arts, human culture, environment, animals, and gifts to others. We're getting kind of pretty small down there in terms of dollars and percentages. But what you have to think about is the work that you do through AgrAbility. Which of these columns do you fit? And it isn't just one, there's probably several of of these columns that could fit with the type of work and services that AgrAbility is involved in. We can have a little bit of question, maybe a few questions or discussion about that after we end, but for sure, we think about human service, we think about health, we think about the public societal benefit, other things in there. And how do we talk about the work that we do through AgrAbility in terms of a societal benefit? We can talk about the benefit of this to the individuals that we serve directly. We have to start thinking about it. What's the benefit of the work that we do to society as a whole? Because that's often what's most interesting or intriguing to the funding community. Now let's shift a little bit and let's talk about types of gifts. And these split into maybe these three categories. Annual gifts, and I would say these are gifts that are given annually to an organization that are in most cases used to support the operations of that organization. So we think about, as a nonprofit, how do they operate? When I think about staffing cost or what it costs to maintain their office or the facility or the direct cost of the services they provide on an ongoing basis. These are often funded through annual gifts or annual contributions. The second one, special projects / major gifts, think about things that have maybe a larger price tag, but there's also a larger impact. Many of you associated with universities, you would understand, when your university gets into a capital campaign, this is an example of major gifts where those things are often used to build a building, help build infrastructure, or to expand maybe into a service area that you had not previously been in, or you want to make some major change to your organization. They fit in this category of special projects / major gifts. And then the third category is the planned giving. In most cases, this goes toward building endowments. And the reason that we have endowments is a way to build kind of that financial stability, because the interest that's earned off of those endowments then kind of comes up and becomes part of that annual gift payments that are made. For example, if your organization had $1 million or $2 million or $3 million and you were drawing 5% return off of that endowment, that money then from that endowment would then circle back into your organization on an annual basis to help offset the cost of operation. So all three of these are important, and all three of these are really connected. We'll talk a little bit later in the presentation of what's the connection between these types of gifts, as well as the connection to our donors and our donor base. This is a chart that kind of shows you the types of gifts, and then on the top, we've put in the types of donors that we talked about earlier. So this one looks at funding sources and the types of gifts. So we think about annual gifts, corporations are a good source for it. Foundations are a poor source for it. Individuals are a good source for it. Special projects, corporations are a good source. Foundations, good to fair, and individuals are good. When we think about endowment, corporations are poor sources. Corporations don't typically give to endowments. And likewise for foundations, they like to see their gifts or the money they make kind of be invested or used right away and not necessarily go into some type of endowment. But individuals are good, if not excellent, sources for endowments, because this is a way for people to kind of leave legacy gifts that help ensure that these organizations exist and serve others in perpetuity. So you think about this, you think about what type of gift are you asking for, it gives you a little sense of where you should be directing some of those efforts when it comes from a fundraising perspective. And this is something that you may want to go back and kind of reference, this idea of the relationship between the donors and the types of gifts that they give. We're going to talk a little bit about fundraising strategies now. We're transitioning a little bit into the third category of those things that were in that kind of overview. So we think about the sources of funds, and we've got cash, assets, and estate wealth. And then we've got uses. What are they used for? Who are the prospects that you need to be thinking about? And what are the fundraising techniques or approaches that you should be using? Across the top, we've got our annual giving, our capital, special projects, and then our planned gifts. So we think about annual giving. Often this is either cash or check or credit card or some type of payment that's made to an organization. And often it's understood when you make these gifts that those kinds of contributions go to support the operations of the organization, and operations being everything from helping to pay salaries, to keeping the lights on, to providing the materials or the direct services. The prospects are a pretty broad set of constituents. And again, those could be all of those donor types that we talked about before, but, primarily companies that we work with, as well as individuals that we work with as well. And then the technique is that there has to be an annual solicitation. There has to be at some point in the year an ask, and many organizations will ask many times over the course of the year, but there has to be this annual solicitation, and we'll talk about how those solicitations are made, that goes to these people kind of every year asking for that gift or the renewal of that gift. Now, if we move the next column, looking at the capital special gifts, we're switching from cash to assets. And think about this from a simple point, the difference between the money that you've got in your checking account and maybe money that you have in either investments or a savings account, or maybe even the gift of property or the gift of stocks or the gift of an automobile in some cases fit into this category. And often when we get into this, these are for special projects. These are gifts that are given that are specifically designed for an organization to take these funds and do something very special or something very specific. That could be everything from building out a new building or standing up a new service project or expanding into an area they haven't previously served. And the prospects on these are often either specific individuals, and I probably would add to that also foundations, because foundations are a good source for these as well. The techniques are opportunistic. It isn't a habit that universities start and these major giving campaigns every 3 to 5 years, almost on a regular basis. A fundraising a mentor of mine at one time, put it like this, that special gifts are when you go out and ask somebody for that gift of a lifetime every 3 or 5 years. So this is where it is somewhat of an opportunistic approach. You have to think about what are the opportunities and how do we take advantage of these opportunities to engage our donors, or to maybe even move some of our donors who have been in this annual gift column now to think a little bit more broadly and be engaged in the organization a little bit more intensely through contributing to these capital special projects. And then the last column is planned gifts, and these are estate wealth that funds these. When people make their wills or whatever mechanisms they set up, they're taking care of their family. They're taking care of some of the organizations which they have had a record of involvement or a history of involvement, or things that align with some of their beliefs and values. And often the gifts that go into these are, those funds that person or has accumulated during their lifetime. And rather than going to heirs, a portion of these gifts may be given to these organizations. What are they often used for? They're mostly used for building endowments. And we talked a little bit about endowments. Again, it's a set of money that is restricted, and from the use of those, and it's really the interest only portion of that an organization benefits. But the goal is for that money to be set aside so that it helps build that financial stability. Universities in particular, this is a big area of focus for them and their development campaigns, and that's why they work so much with individuals, predominantly alumni of those institutions, and really, build lifelong relationships, getting them started with this annual giving, moving to special projects, but ultimately moving those folks toward endowment, so they're including that institution as a part of their estate plan or gift. So the prospects is everyone. And so you think out with a pretty broad base of both, all of these sources, but individuals are probably the best source of these ones. And so that's important that we think about individuals as a key part, because not only they give the most, they have the opportunity to probably give different types of gifts, and ultimately those moving into those planned gifts. And again, the best techniques for this is regular promotions and keeping people just constantly thinking about this idea of, have you thought about leaving XYZ organization in your will, or how the legacy that they leave through their giving. So, when you hear of people leaving these large sums of money, that's not the first gift they gave to an organization. It usually started with them giving gifts on an annual basis. And at some point, we're asked to give to some of these special gifts, special projects. But ultimately, because of that, at some point in their life, the timing is right, and they are either asked or they're being asked to consider a planned gift or an estate gift as a part of their legacy to the organization. So when we think about fundraising strategies, and I'm going to reach these from probably the least intensive to the most intensive, and the first one is mail, and in today's that can often be email solicitations, and these are a good way to make annual contributions. We talked back to those annual asks that you need to make. Those are a very effective way that people like to be just reminded. It isn't necessarily asking them. For those people who are already giving, you're really asking / reminding them that it's time to make their annual contribution. You all have received those. We all respond differently to those, but for a lot of organizations, that's probably an entry point into getting people to renew or to become lifelong donors. Often starts with these because you can reach lots and lots of people, whereas some of these others get very more intense. We'll move on down to telephone calls. Probably not as much today as it has been in the past because email has kind of replaced some of that. But I would also say text messages and other things. I get a lot of what I would say solicitation by text messages these days. It seems to be increasing. Just a different way to build those relationships, but often hearing personally from someone in the organization often prompts somebody to make those contributions. We move down to grant writing, and this is in here for both. Some of it has some aspects of individual giving. When you get into these bigger dollar ask, even if it's an individual, they're going to want to see a proposal. They're going to want to see the specifics of how their funds are going to be used and what's going to be accomplished and how the money is going to be stewarded. But for foundations, this is as important as it is in your government grant writing. They want to know all these things, and even our companies today use corporate foundations. These are often separate organizations from the main company, and they're directly responsible for a lot of the philanthropy or philanthropic investments that they make. And they're going to want to see some of these same things, explaining projects in detail, providing lots of information about the impact and also the evaluation aspect of it and things that are going to be accomplished with that. And number 10 is probably the most intensive, but probably the most successful, and that being the face-to-face meetings with donors. But remember, the larger the ask, the more intense the relationship and the more direct that the contact will be. For example, you would not be asking for an endowment or a major gift through number 7, mail or email. Those are for annual contributions. We're really talking about face-to-face meetings with folks for these larger projects. And again, more of a relationship building, relationship maintaining piece. There's a lot of science, even research in philanthropy that says how many times should you have contact with a donor before you ask them for a gift? And then once you've asked them for that gift, how many contacts with that donor are important to make sure that the next ask you make is received well and they feel connected to an organization. If donors do not feel connected to the organization, you're not going to be very successful in retaining those or growing those into the types of donors that you want. If Paul had told me today that I could only bring one slide, it probably would have brought this slide because it does a good way of puts it in context of what we're talking about. We think about fundraising strategies. And the best way to describe it is through what we call this donor pyramid. And so at the base of that donor pyramid is we talk about the universe of suspects and prospects. And we have everybody out there, but the difference between the suspect and the prospect is the prospect has some kind of connection to your organization and is probably more likely to be a donor. Suspects out there would be everybody and anybody. We have to kind of decide who are the people that have some connection to organization that are most likely to be involved. And then as we test those people through mail, direct mail, or email or even sometimes telemarketing, fundraising, our benefits, activities, the things we do is also a way to draw people into the organization. Those are where we find our first-time donors. And then we think about, well, how many of those donors, when it gets to that second year or third year, renew and maybe in some cases increase their giving. And that's a good metric to measure and follow as well. And then by this time, we're talking about year 4, 5, 6 in a relationship with a donor. How do we go to them and say, you've been a donor for our organization for many years, and we're trying to do X, Y, Z. Would you make a gift to help us do that? And that's where we kind of shift from that annual funding into now doing special projects. And, when we get into those, those have to be handled much more differently. And it requires a lot more contact and more dependent upon the relationships we have with these people, or people that we're working with have relationship. It isn't all up to you. Think about if you have an advisory committee or a board or people like that, what role can those people help you in not only making contact, but maintaining contacts with those? So when we get into this capital donor, those are the people that are helping us build buildings or make those major expansions to our organization. Those are through personal contacts only. Those are not the kinds of asks that are made over the phone or through an e-letter or any other kind of one. They're really face to face. And then the planned gift of donor again is personal contact only. These become very personal, but very, I would say, intense, but rewarding relationships. Having worked in this area and worked with people who feel so committed to your organization, who believe so much in your organization, that they want to leave the wealth or the gift that they've accumulated through their lifetime, and they want that to be their legacy or a way to make sure that the work that you are doing continues beyond their ability. And again, this is the culmination of many, many years of giving as an individual donor, and really starting at the bottom of this pyramid and then working your way all the way to the top. If you started with 1,000 or maybe 10,000 people at the bottom of this period, you could probably count the number of people at the top of this on one hand or two, because it's a relative small percentage that make it through that one. But this is where it's important to have some mechanisms, some software systems, things that help you track who are these people and what's their record of giving, and who are the people that, from a development perspective, you should be maybe paying a little bit more closer attention to. So when we think about the fundraising cycle, and it is a cycle, a kind of a circular cycle, it really starts with this idea of how do we identify these people? And the first thing we do is don't rush out and ask them for money. There needs to be some type of cultivation. If your organization is involved in doing events, inviting those people to the events that you might host is a form of cultivation. Coming in contact with these people, sending them your newsletter, all the ways that you reach out to them and begin to cultivate that relationship and see if there's enough there that these are the people who may want to support your organization. But after you've done some cultivation, the next critical step becomes solicitation. For the beginning donor, it's how do you reach out to them in the appropriate way and ask them to contribute to your organization through a small annual gift. And if you can do that and you can repeat it and you can grow that gift over time, that's a good signal that this is a type that you may want to think about maybe at some point moving to the next level in that fundraising cycle relationship. And the key part of that is what we call post-gift investor relations. And that's everything from making sure that you acknowledge that gift through the right kind of thank you, that you continue to involve that person in the organization. What I think turns donors off is that the only time they hear from the organization is when they're asking for money. So you need to think about your communications. You need to think about events that you do as an organization, how your organization is visible, and how are you providing the opportunity for some of your donors to have some kind of engagement. It doesn't necessarily have to be active, high-level engagement, but if your donors are engaged or they feel connected to your organization, they're much more likely to repeat those gifts and to grow those gifts. And then, of course, the next thing is that cultivation for the next gift. And part of that is communications, the education about your organization, helping them, understand the mission, vision of the organization, but also helping them see the good work you're doing and the importance of the work you're doing. And this is where, sharing stories, testimonials, things like this come into play, because that's a tangible way people feel connected to an organization that said, my gift did make a difference. This is a kind of organization that I think I should support or continue to support. and most people are not single organizational things they give to. They give to multiples of organization, and often first big is are they ask, and the second was does the mission vision of that organization align or resonate with their own personal value system. So this becomes a part of it. And then as we do that cultivation, it's this, we move back into that identification. It's a circular pattern. We move it round and around that wheel. But at some point we reach those thresholds. We think about the next big campaign or the next big push that we may want to make. And who are the donors that are probably the best positioned to help us make that next big step in the organization? So kind of think about, from a fundraising cycle and a process perspective, this continually moving fundraising cycle. So kind of just a little bit wrapping up here, we talk about kind of 6 principles of philanthropy or philanthropic giving that I think about. One is that most people give money because they want to. They will not give money if they don't want to. It's there has to be a desire on their part to give money. And so I think there's a feeling out there amongst people as they start to have the means, then start looking at the organizations that they have. And I think this idea to, for those who are successful, this interest in see the opportunities to give back. But again, people want to make sure they're giving to the right organizations. It isn't just a random act of making contributions. I think they need to see some kind of connectedness. And the second one is people don't give unless they're asked. There has to be an initial ask. There's a lot of people that, respect the work of organizations, admire the work of organizations, but unless they're asked at some point through some means, they are not likely to give. And the third one is that people give money to people. The people and the relationship of the people who are involved in that organization are important. So this is where this continual, going back to my very early slide about the basic premise that fundraising is a relationship business, and that fundraising and fundraising go hand in hand. The involvement of individuals, the relationship of people, being able to talk to people about what you do, why you do it, how you do it, is very important. The fourth one is that people give money to opportunities, not to need. We see a lot of commercials, and you see a lot of ads out there that are, about giving to cure diseases and things like that. And again, what they're asking them to do is to help support the opportunities to seek the cure or to assist people. And to a certain degree, what we do through AgrAbility is it's providing an opportunity for somebody to do something that maybe because of the physical disability they'd want. So we make sure that we're really talking about the opportunities that our organization provides, and really think about it, not as the aspect of the disability or the injury or whatever may have caused it. What are the opportunities for that person going forward? And likewise, connecting the next one from 5 and back to 4, people will give to success, not to distress. It isn't that we should be asking for money when there's a fire going on or something like that. I think they really probably respond better to ask when we're really thinking about the success of an organization. How can their gift help this organization be successful? And be successful not meaning accumulate large sums of money, but use the funds they have to really serve the public good and to serve individuals as part of that. So I think about this: people give to success, not to stress. And I like what connected to that as well is people give money to make a change for good. I think we're looking at, what difference will my contribution make? What will be the effect of it? And I think that helps, is one of the questions that goes through people's mind when they're thinking about making a contribution. What difference will my contribution make? Is it going to be just one of many that I really don't see a change in the organization? And that's often what will turn donors away or cause donors to shift their funds to the organization, is they're not seeing the good that's coming out of those contributions. So we have to think about that in our communications. We're always pointing out the difference, the success, the good we're doing, not only for the individuals, getting back to that earlier point about the societal benefit of the goods, the services, the assistance that we're providing as a part of being involved with this organization. So when we think about your own situation, we think about, how do you make the case for support? And some of the questions that you may be thinking about that you need to maybe be asking yourself or asking others in your organization is, how does your organization stack up or stand out? Is your organization driven by a compelling mission? Is your organization based upon sound principles and values? Can you articulate who you serve and how you serve them? What's the service product that makes your organization unique or different from other nonprofits around you? And do you have data, stories, or information that back this up, that back up the request you're making for support? And then the other thing to think about is, how do you say thank you to the people who do support you? How do you say thank you? And there's probably a right way and a wrong way. The wrong way is to not say anything. The wrong way is to maybe to often do too much, because in the donor's mind, they say, well, how much of my gift went to support this gift you gave me back? And for many people, that's kind of a turnoff. But I think to do it sincerely and tastefully and in a professional manner is important. And I think as you think about, if you ask for a gift, you need to be thinking about, well, how are we going to thank those donors? How are we going to acknowledge them, not just right after the gift, but throughout the year and all the other things we do? How do we continue to say thank you to make those people feel engaged? And more importantly, how do we continue their involvement long term in the work that we're doing? So, Paul, I'm going to wrap up there, and if we have some time, and here's my email. I'm happy to answer any emails later about specific questions or things like that. As Paul mentioned, I've had the opportunity to serve on the National AgrAbility Advisory Committee for many years in this area of how do we help not just the national organization, but the state projects become more sustainable. And that definition of sustainability is, how do we diversify their mix of fundings? How do they become less dependent on grant funding? And do they at some point have the ability to continue the work they're doing if at some point that grant funding decreases or goes away? Because that's kind of the true test of sustainability at that point. So thank you. And Paul, I'll stop sharing, and if you've got some questions, I would be happy to do my best to answer.
Thank you, Kent. And as always, we appreciate your input, both at our meetings and throughout the year and today. Again, just some excellent points to think about. I go back to that thought you had early in the presentation about the different aspects of work that we do, in terms of providing community good. With AgrAbility, we deal with health issues, we deal with employment. So I think, thinking of some of going through those categories and just trying to, think about ways that we might be able to promote the project and be able to appeal to different organizations or different groups that might be willing to provide some funding through, again, looking at different aspects of what we do is an excellent point to think about. I'm going to turn things over to Ed Sheldon, who is assisting today, and I know he's been collecting a few, at least, questions in the chat, and I'm thinking somebody is wanting to ask a question. Ed, I need to unmute Ed so he can get on here and do his thing. Let's see, we'll make him a co-host. And again, if you have a question you'd like to ask verbally, just go down to the reactions icon at the bottom and click the raise hand icon, and we will plan to unmute you. Ed?
Okay, I'm here, and usually I try to share slides with the questions, but I got something all fouled up with it, so we're not going to try to do that. We're just going to ask the questions and that have come in either on the chat or through a personal message. Okay, we'll go back up here to the beginning. And I think this is definitely a big one for anybody in AgrAbility or similar type organizations. How do we establish a culture of actively pursuing sustainability when our organization relies so heavily on our USDA grant funding? And how do we change that mindset in our own minds?
Part of it is, I've even brought this up that there really needs to be in the grant process a discussion about sustainability. For example, we often these grants are to start these organizations up, but is there, should there maybe be some thought about it's at XY point, if that grant is for 3 years, by that point, what portion of that grant funding have we replaced with ongoing annual funding? And, even this idea that, we start building partnerships with the idea that um, at some point the organization becomes, self-sufficient, standalone, or if not fully, at least partially. Um, and part of that is to the partnerships that you build as an organization. One of the things we have an advantage to in agriculture that I think is a great asset that I didn't talk about here, and that's really we talk about corporations, foundation, individuals, but we've got a great nonprofit sector that supports agriculture, from producer organizations, from general farm organizations, things like that. And a lot of these organizations are national, but they also have state-based affiliates. Many of them are benefiting from checkoff funds, producer-driven things that we can take advantage of. And as we think about enlisting those folks as partners in our projects early on, with the idea that not only can they support the organization by helping direct people to the services of AgrAbility, but how can they also become maybe in some ways financial partners in the organization, so that these organizations have a chance of continuing on and at least have a foothold for sustainability in that initial period. Yes, in the initial period, you're going to be highly funded. But from a foundation perspective, foundations often, if you don't have a plan or at least path to sustainability, they're not going to provide you the startup funding to go there. And likewise, on those, we think about what's the pathway to sustainability. And, maybe that's part of when we think about the funding program. Of course, that's not my decision. That's USDA's decision on what they put in the grant application. But I think that needs to be a component of thought. If you're going to start doing this work, are you doing it with the idea that, well, if we don't receive next funding, we just fold up the tents and go home? I think the work we are doing is more important than that. And so we need to be thinking as we work, build these partnerships. I think it was a stroke of genius that there was a mandate that these universities identify nonprofit partners. But maybe we don't take a full advantage of those nonprofit partners and working with them to think about sustainability, because they often have maybe more opportunities and less constraints to go out and do some of those fundraising activities than some of you who are working directly as university employees in these situations.
Okay. Move on to the next one that came in. How do we determine how should we determine how often to make the ask?
Well, there needs to be at least an annual solicitation, an annual ask, and different organizations handle that differently. You start with a database of people you want to ask, and you send out the solicitations, and you record who gave and who didn't, and you ought to be able to sort that database to say if they already gave, and you go back and ask them again, that's faux pas. You need to be able to sort out and send the thank yous to the folks who did. But if you send that same solicitation to people who just gave you money 3 or 4 months ago, they're kind of like, well, didn't I just give you money, kind of thing? So I think you need to have within your processes, say, if you started with let's say 100 people, and the first time you sent that, first quarter you sent that solicitation out, 30 people responded. When you send that second solicitation out, you don't send it out to all 100. You send it out to the 70 who didn't respond. And if that second one, you get another 20, then that third solicitation, those 2 first groups of donors are removed. You're thanking those donors, but then you're going to, so that potentially that gets smaller, but you're also adding maybe people on to that one. So, it's going to get smaller and smaller, but I think you can really alienate donors if you make the ask and don't acknowledge the fact that they've already given. And I think the other thing too is, as you're doing that ask, make sure you're also acknowledging the donors who've given in the past. So, maybe that communication or newsletter or something acknowledges who the people who have joined your organization or have supported your organization in the last quarter.
Okay. And I know you talked about this, but I think it probably bears repeating anyway. How much should we include our clients in sharing their own stories as part of our fundraising?
You know, I think you should. I think you should think about the clients you serve, the other volunteers, things like that, because those are the people. When people have given of their time, they've given their most valuable resource. I worked for an organization that was very much volunteered, and there was almost a paranoia about asking volunteers to give money because, well, if they've already volunteered, we can't ask them. Well, they've already given you their most valuable contribution. That's their time. Um, and when you go to ask them then for funds, yeah, if they've already given you their time, there is a there's data that supports this. There is a relationship between people who give their time and support the organization. They're not disconnected. They're supporting some other organization because you haven't asked them. We think about constituents. I think not only the constituents, but the family of those constituents, because they see firsthand, and maybe in the immediate cycle, they don't see that, but sometimes the 2, 3 years down the road, particularly those where they're seeing a marked either quality of life improvement and things like that. I think those are the people who are most likely to support your organization over time, and ultimately people who are going to say, that organization helped change our family. It affected the direction our family was going and things like that. Those are the entities who are probably the most likely to leave those endowment gifts at some time. You may not see it in your lifetime or the next one, but the reason that person gave was because somebody way, way, way back served that person and their family, and it made a difference. And I think to think about that.
Okay. Oh, let's see. I'm reading the question. Earlier, you said foundations are a poor source for annual support. Can you explain a little more about that? Dive a little deeper into that.
Foundations, as a most part, exist to affect some kind of a social change. So their agendas are often limited to certain things that they have. They like to make larger contributions, not on an annual basis, but things that affect change. So if you're saying, there are foundations that are set up there to serve as matching for individuals for bricks and mortar. There's ones for program expansion, things like that. A lot of these big philanthropic foundations do not have good track records of making annual contributions for an organization because they see that as other people's responsibility. But if there's something big, major change you want to make, they're almost think about them things as philanthropic investors. And it isn't that they're going to be the annual supporter, but if you got an idea, big idea, and you want that big idea is going to change your organization or expand your reach or put you on a different path, they're more likely to invest in that with a larger contribution versus that smaller ongoing one. That's just not where they see themselves playing.
Okay. Some good examples of thank you gifts and actions. I know we discussed the importance of it, but what are some good examples?
Well, start with the good. A very sincere, handwritten or very professionally done letter, acknowledging them, thanking them, talking about the impact that their gift was made, and then making sure that you're including them in your ongoing communications that they're receiving. If you put out a quarterly or monthly newsletter, how are they seeing and how are they seeing what your organization's doing? And if you put out any kind of annual report or things like that, I think, don't list the specific individuals make, but I think you can create, categories of donors, people who've given $100 or less or up to 500 or 1,000 or 5,000, whatever. I think you can, when you put out those publications, there should be opportunity to release those. And even, some organizations, depending upon the size of gift, have lists of those donors and stuff on display in their offices. I've seen in building capital campaigns, things like that, they've started walkways with bricks, where people there's always a permanent connection to that building. I was involved in that with the National FFA Center many years ago. Those are ways of, I think the bad ways are when gifts get too extravagant or there's no acknowledgement at all, and that's kind of extreme. If you were to send in money and you didn't hear anything, not even a thank you note, and getting back to that, what makes a difference? Sometimes the handwritten notes. As arcane as that may sound, the handwritten notes really that somebody personally recognized your contribution is important. So I think about that. Going overboard with something that almost equates the value of the gift is one, it doesn't make any sense. But the more important part is that it embarrasses the donor. And I think that's one of the things you want to think about, that you don't embarrass people by going overboard on the acknowledgement or the sometimes thank you gift. You see some of these telemarketing things where they're offering something, and part of the big turnoff for me is, how much of what I'm giving is going to support that gift and not just actually the cost. And people aren't giving those money to get the gift. They're giving it to support the cost. If they're giving it to get the gift, those are probably not the donors that are going to be back for a second year. They're just going to be one-time donors.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. The last one I see on the list so far, unless somebody sends one in, is how about crowdfunding? How is crowdfunding changing the fundraising landscape?
It's probably an area that I've not had a lot of experience. I've dabbled in a little bit, but again, the crowdfunding, you have to be able to get back to that last slide on how can you make a compelling case for support? Because even if it's a flash or something like that, you have to be able to make the compelling case. You have to move people to make that gift. And I think social media, crowdfunding, things like that are a little bit harder to do. And the other thing too, I think the jury's out is that a one-time thing, or how many of those gifts are sustainable? What you really, sometimes your acquisition cost for a first-time donor is going to be on par with what they gave, but you don't think about how much they gave in terms of 1 year. You think about the lifetime value of a donor. And so if you have somebody who gave you a $100 contribution that repeated that, say, over 20, 30 years, what's the value of that versus maybe somebody who went on to one of these crowdfunding sources and said, oh, I gave 100, I gave $200, I'm kind of done. And so I think, the jury's out yet on crowdfunding. Are you just attracting different donors each time you do it? Or are you really building a loyal donor base, which will support your organization repeatedly over many years?
Okay, we do have a raised hand from Samuel Rose. And Sam, are you able to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you. I sometimes feel like running a small nonprofit. I kind of sometimes feel, especially the startup phase, I feel like my own worst enemy. Like I'm on this hamster wheel of creating these dynamic projects to get the funding, and then between actually doing the projects and administrating and reporting, I feel like I went over what that budget was, and then I have to create the next dynamic project that calls people's attention to get the funding, and so it just keeps on going on and on and on. I've talked to a lot of people who feel that way, and I understand it's like probably a mindset and a planning thing, but do you have any suggestions of how to kind of just go in with the correct mindset to avoid those kind of pitfalls?
I think that if an organization becomes too dependent upon project funding, and I've seen this a lot in organizations where they're really driven by project funding, so they attract donors to the projects. And the problem with projects is the majority of the funds that go to a project have to go directly to the project, and very little is left to support the overall or operational cost of it. So I think when you think about these, you need to think about developing an annual campaign that people make regular ongoing contributions to. And over time, you build that number and base of it, because that gives you more of a cushion than put on top of that those special projects. If you start with special projects as your base level of funding, and you don't have this ongoing base of annual funding, then you're more likely to get in. I think this feeling, Samuel, being on this treadmill, that you're always kind of chasing money to do that. So how you get off that, I think you think about before you next start that. How do you go back to the base of funders that have been yours funders and say, help us make sure that we got the capacity going forward to do this good work. I had a boss one time to come up with all the special projects. He said, we could go broke doing special projects because so much energy goes, not only financial energy, but organizational energy goes into the special projects. We don't really think about the base level of funding that supports the overall organization. I think we have to make sure we get that in place, and then as that starts to take off, then layer on the special projects that then in some ways fuel the work we do.
Does look like we had one more question in the chat there, Ed. Did you see that?
Yes, I saw it just come in, Kent. I'll just read this one and you can take off with it. For rural farmers who also have low literacy, how would they go about sourcing for funds for their organization other than individual donations?
Let's see, maybe a question. If you talk about how does a nonprofit, let me read that again, Ed. I wasn't sure if it was, we're talking about a farmer raising money. We're really talking about an organization raising money. Yeah.
Well, I'd say, for rural farmers who also have low literacy, how would they go about sourcing funds for their organization other than individual donations?
Well, I think other than individual organizations, again, agriculture is very blessed to have this vast community of farm organizations, producer organizations, everything from farm bureaus to the pork producers to almost every commodity organization out there. And some of these organizations, even at a county level, are I wouldn't say extremely well funded, but they're well funded, and they have sources of funds maybe that if we can make the case of how they are helping. Now, they're not likely to give to an individual directly. Most of these have to be channeled through nonprofit organizations. So the first thing would be is are you positioning yourself to receive funds? And that's where you either need to have that nonprofit status or be working with an organization that has that nonprofit status to even be eligible for that kind of funding. So, you think about from a very standpoint, if an individual goes out and starts asking money as for an individual, and you're not either organized or aligned with a qualified nonprofit, you're not going to be very successful. So you need that first. And often from organizations, if you're just doing a startup, the best way would be to find an organization who would kind of take you under their umbrella and let you work through that organization where actually they're giving to that nonprofit, but the nonprofit then agrees to funnel that information. But the whole intent then is to give people an opportunity to get their nonprofit organization stood up. And again, these nonprofit organizations are organized not on a federal level, but really chartered through state governments.
Did have a follow-up comment to that question. It looks like ideally there's someone in the network or their network, referring to the question above, who's willing to, now my chat moved, to donate grant writing time. So
yeah, and a lot of times, again, it goes back to I think the wisdom, the foresight of when this program was stood up, having this university partner with nonprofits, and ideally more than one nonprofit, because there's a lot of things that they bring to the bear. A lot of times the university has the technical expertise, but the fundraising, the nonprofit, that part of it really comes from the nonprofit partners, and they may have mechanisms already in place that help support that work. So, I think there is opportunity, and I think sometimes we try to involve those nonprofit organizations a lot, maybe in helping provide technical support, where really their area of expertise may be more bringing it from to how do we make this thing sustainable? How do we generate the funding that's going to allow us to do the things operationally that we need to do?
Absolutely. If you see your chat, Rachel from, is it Land for Good? Is that yes, Land for Good has made a couple comments and pointing out things like multi-year federal grants that can be very helpful for organizations, and local communities, but they're a bear to write if you don't know what you're getting into. And she also put her email address there for more information. So that's awesome. Thank you, Rachel.
Along that line, Ed, I've never seen a government grant that didn't have a section that said, what are your additional sources of funds? And so you need to have some of that in mind, either funds that you've raised or plans to go out and expand your fundraising, because, even the federal government doesn't want to be the sole funder of a project. They want to say, how are you bringing other sources to the table that are making the funds that they give go even further? And I think that's kind of universally held. I see that same thing in corporate funding. I see the same thing in nonprofits. I say, who else are you bringing to the table? How are you sharing the cost of this in a way that makes sense?
And that goes back to the sustainability question we had at the very beginning of the question and answer.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Kent. Some great advice. We are recording this, and hopefully many in the future will be able to gain some insights and wisdom from your presentation today. Thank you also to everybody who participated. Again, the recording we hope to get up on the website in the next few days, and feel free to check that out and refer others. Our next session in this series is in 1 month, and it's on farm stress. Let me double check. For those that are still on, you'll get a notification. But July 24th, building capacity for farm stress resilient communities, and we hope you'll be able to join us for that one. So with that, we say thank you again, and we wish you a good rest of the day.